I didn't know what to name this lecture. I guess I call it the next generation composers and their music that became part of the Israeli cultural experience. And what I mean by that is that, we talked 2 weeks ago about the St. Petersburg Jewish Music Society, Gesellschaft, and out of that came a number of composers that really wrote wonderful, wonderful, meaningful music. In a certain sense, took the folk music of their time and transcribed it into an artistic form. What I'm going to try to do in this lecture is show that some of their, as they moved to Israel, there were a new group of composers that came in contact with these composers and created beautiful music of their own. A lot of them were from the Eastern European area, but there was a real a conflict, a goal to create music that was not necessarily Eastern European. And so the harmony shifted a little, the rhythmic qualities shifted, or I shouldn't say qualities, but the rhythmic styles shifted. Let's go to Israel for the first Aliyah. The first efforts to create a corpus of music suitable for a new Jewish identity that would eventually become Israel started in probably around 1882. That was the year of the first Aliyah, the first wave of Jewish immigrants to seek to create a national homeland in what was then Palestine. At that point, there were no songs yet written for this national movement. The Zionist youth movements in Germany and elsewhere did publish songbooks using traditional German and other folk melodies with the new words written in Hebrew. So there were new texts, but not the melodies were from the countries that they came from. A good example of this probably is Hatikva, because the new words, I should say, by the Hebrew poet Naftali Herz Imber, expresses the longing of the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel, the land of Zion. The melody, I know that people talk about the Moldau of Smetana. I have a feeling Smetana didn't know about anything about the Jewish, about Israel or Herzl or anything. He just wrote a melody that maybe he heard that was a folk tune. We don't know. There's a lot of possibilities there. But in essence, the melodies are similar. They're not Jewish made particularly. In 1895, this is 13 years later, settlers have been moving into Israel from the first Aliyah. They create the first Jewish orchestra in Palestine. It's more of a band, a wind band probably, in the town of Rishon LeZion. They played light classics and marches and that kind of thing. So it was a band. Now, this gentleman right here, Avraham Tzvi Idelson, is a trained Cantor from Russia, an incredibly important musicologist, writes a book, don't remember the name right now, but it might be called something like Jewish Music. I've read it. It's extremely instructive and one of the best, but a lot of his theories may have been gone by the board with the new musicology that's going on in the last 100 years, but it's extremely instructive, specifically how Jewish music was thought in the beginning of the 20th century. He's born in Russia. He settles in Jerusalem in 1906 with the objective of studying and documenting the musics of various Jewish communities there. It's similar to Engel, what he did when he was in Russia, similar to, if I may use this non-Jewish composer, Bela Bartok, who eclipses everybody in his research, going out into the communities, into the sticks and finding these melodies that people used to sing. So, and he does that. He goes to the Yemenite enclave, the Hasidic, the Syrian, and other Jewish ethnic groups in and around the Jerusalem area. And he meticulously documents the songs and musical idioms of these groups. He also, by the way, makes the first efforts to bring these songs to the attention of all Jewish settlers with the aim of creating a new Jewish musical genre. He's joined in Palestine by a few more classically trained musicians and ethnomusicologists, including Gershon Ephros, we'll talk about him at a later time. In 1909, Ephros comes to Israel. Joel Engel, 15 years later, in 1924, we certainly talked about him and heard some of his music. We will hear more of his music today. And by the way, like Edelson, as I mentioned, Edelson works to look for those melodies wherever he can find them in a Jewish form. We also talked about this gentleman, Hanina Karshevsky. The title here is a title of a music pamphlet that he writes, Tzlili Hanina, which are the melodies of Hanina Karshevsky. One of the melodies we've heard, as a matter of fact, I've played it twice, once on a service and once, certainly at one of our things, or before a service, I should say, before Shabbat. Agadat Kineret. Remember that? We heard that in the previous lecture. So over the next 30 years, we're talking about, the 20s to the 50s, composers or late 40s, composers in Palestine begins to seek a kind of a new rhythmic and melodic mode that would really distinguish their songs from the traditional European music that they have been brought up on, because all these composers come from Russia, Hungary, Romania, Poland, Germany. And those music cultures in those countries were incredibly strong. And so it's just inevitable that these composers would take on the dominant culture of where they come from and use it in their own repertoire. But they wanted to break away. One way to break away, there was a Yemenite community in Palestine from early 1900s. And what they tried to do is imitate the sounds of those Yemenite and other Arabic and Middle Eastern music and into their own music. We'll talk about that later. And it was done very successfully too. These composers, very interesting, used simple harmonies, preferring just regular minor to natural, if I can be technical, the natural minor to the melodic and harmonic minors, because the melodic harmonic minors have more black notes in them. They wanted simple harmonies. They liked major scales, and they definitely did not like this scale. I'll sing it to you right now. It's very Russian sounding, and quite frankly, extremely Jewish sounding when you think about cantorial music, because it is. But they did not, a lot of that kind of a gypsy minor style that's used in klezmer music, these composers did not go for. They called the character depressing and sentimental. So they wanted just to avoid all the sentimentalism and go right to, either whatever they're trying to describe, but keep things simple. A composer by the name of Emanuel Zamir, a beautiful musical last name, obviously, works in the 40s and 50s in a genre known as Shirei Ro'im, which are shepherd songs. How does he do that? He combines, ready for this one, Bedouin music with kind of biblical style lyrics accompanied by a recorder. And we'll hear some of that. So the movement to create a repertoire of Hebrew songs, and specifically a definitive music style for these songs, was seen not just as a creative outlet for these individual composers, but because of the Halutz movement and all these other movements to create independence in Israel, it was seen as a kind of a national imperative. This drive, this imperative, influences literature, theater, the arts, as well as music. Again, it was to seek the cultural roots of the new Israeli nation and kind of combine that with some memory, as contrived maybe as it is, a memory of the culture of the ancient Hebrews of the Bible. So how do they do that? First of all, they get a lot of national institutions supporting them. The Histadrut Labor Union publishes many songbooks and subsidizes the compositions by these composers. How about this one? Public sing-alongs were actively encouraged. I know that when I was in Israel, when I was between ages 5 and 11, there was tremendous thrust in the schools singing. It didn't matter if you had a voice or not. You sang these songs, and it created a kind of a sense of national pride. There's no question about it. So, by the way, these songs were a way of teaching Hebrew to new immigrants from Europe, from Middle Eastern countries, and also the United States. When you would make Aliyah, you'd sing these songs, and they were a very natural way to learn the language. So, moving on. Okay, starting in the 1920s, here's another element that I want to introduce you to based on what we're going to listen to. Cafe and cabaret music becomes popular in Israel. So there's composers Nachum Nardi, which we'll talk about today, Moshe Wilensky, which we won't talk about today. And I'll tell you something, this makes he and a bunch of other composers, I feel guilt not talking about them. I will talk about them at a later time, but because they're extremely important. But a lot of times, I guess when I'm doing these, either I do a real history and I go year by year, or a kind of a potpourri kind of thing. And I think this was a kind of a potpourri idea. I wanted to show you some of the music that I love. There was a poet, Natan Alterman, whom you see in this picture, wrote a lot of the music for these cabarets. So these cabarets contributed to diversity in Israeli music. Many of these songs were popular, light style, distinct from the Russian, the folk style that Joel Engel brought to the country. Many of these songs were in the major key rather than minor. How about this one? Many of them had upbeat rhythms, tangos, sambas, and other Latin styles. And so these cabarets and reviews had political satire, drama, and so they spoke about the political situation in Palestine before it became Israel, and Israel after it became Israel. So also another contributor to the music of this time was the large aliyah of musicians in the 1930s, which really contributed to Israel's music culture because of the Nazi takeover in Europe, forced many, many Jewish musicians to leave. Some of these musicians came to Israel, obviously, some elsewhere. The immigration included some of the leading classical musicians of Europe, including composers like Partosh, you don't know that name, Paul Ben Chaim, I think some of you know, some of the choir people know, Alexander Boskowitz, wonderful composer, and Huberman, Bronislaw Huberman, who was played, I believe, in the Berlin Philharmonic, was a major violinist, started the Israel Philharmonic at that time because he had to escape Europe with the help of Toscanini. So interesting. So just as writers of popular music sought a new style, many classical composers like Partosh and Paul Ben Chaim also sought new styles in their new modes of composition that would give expression to this Israeli identity. So, for example, Boskowitz, who I just mentioned, he writes a piece called Semitic Suite for piano. It's very homophonic with a kind of a drone accompaniment, it imitates a kind of an Arabic oud in the piano writing. And Paul Ben Chaim writes a sonata a tre for trembolo, mandolin, and guitar. Beautiful combination. Has very distinctly Middle Eastern sound. Okay, let's now jump in the pool because I want to play music. I want to talk about some of the poets along with the composers of this music. Here is the great Hebrew poet of modern times. He is still known as the national poet of Israel. This is Chaim Nachman Bialik, born in 1873, dies in 1934, born in the Ukraine. At 18, he goes to Odessa and becomes active in Jewish literary circles. He kind of goes to Berlin after that, another place. He finally gets to Tel Aviv in 1924. And then he devotes himself to cultural activities there. And he is now known as Israel's great poet. Everyday life versus liturgical. And I want to say this because most of the poetry we're going to see here does not deal with the Jewish, but the Israeli experience. But here's one I want to show you. Hachama merosh ha'ilanot nistalka. Boav nis, I can't even read this. Likrat Shabbat Hamalka. bo'u v'nitzeh, likrat Shabbat hamalka, hine hi yoredet hakadusha habrucha, bo'achem l'shalom malachei hashalom. Translation, just quickly. The sun on the treetops no longer is seen. Come gather to welcome the Queen, our Sabbath. Behold her descending, the holy, the blessed, with angels, a cohort of peace and of rest. Draw nigh, O Queen, and here abide. Draw nigh, O Sabbath bride. Peace also to you, ye angels of peace. There's a beautiful song that should be sung, is sung by a lot of Israeli choirs, actually, and it's supposed to be sung right before the onset of Shabbat, right before Kabbalat Shabbat. Here, by the way, this is Pinchas Minkowski. He's the guy. He's born also in the Ukraine. He comes to New York as a cantor, and then in the 19th century, he comes to New York as a cantor. He goes back to Odessa, stays there for 30 years, but he knows Bialik. He was very deeply involved in Bialik's intellectual movement when they were in Odessa, and he writes the melody. And listen to this beautiful melody. This is a modern arrangement of it. Shabbat Hamalka. I won't play the whole thing as usual. And then there's a second verse with more of the same text. We've welcomed the Shabbat with song and prayer, etc., etc. Beautiful, beautiful melody. And it's certainly, I've used this melody, and it's used now, this time. Okay, well, that's not what I wanted. Okay, now we move on to another poet, Avigdor Hameiri, also born in the Ukraine, 1890, and passes away in Israel in 1970. He is a great poet, and I'm going to talk about two poems of his that, and we were going to hear one of the great poems that he wrote in song. So he's captured in 1916 by the Russians when he's serving as an Austrian officer on the Russian front. That's in World War I. He gets imprisoned in Siberia and gets released after the October Revolution, obviously, because Lenin and the Communist Party take over. And right away he emigrates, or a couple of years later, 4 years later, actually, 4 years, emigrates in 1921 to Palestine. He joins the staff of the Haaretz newspaper, and he's editor of literary journals. And he deals with a lot of theater in Israel. He writes over 30 books, poetry, novels, short stories, the whole thing. It's beautiful stuff, beautiful stuff. So before he comes to Israel, he writes, right after, he writes a piece that is, I need to read you this poem. Shnei michtavim, 2 letters. First part, I'm going to give both letters. First part, on delicate paper as white as the dawn. And I want you to remember what I'm saying now, because we have the song after. On delicate paper, as white as the dawn, comes a letter from the diaspora. A mother is writing with tears in her eyes to my good son in Jerusalem. Your father is dead. Your mother is sick. Come home, gentle son. We wait for you endlessly from morning to evening. Come home. For springtime, gentle son. Second letter. On simple paper as gray as ashes, a letter goes to the diaspora. A pioneer writes with tears in his eyes. In 1924, in Jerusalem, forgive me, my sick mother. If you still love me, come hug me. I will be a wanderer no longer. I will never move from here, never. Wow. 1 second, I want to, okay. Me'al Piskat, the song from Mount Scopus. It comes from a traditional melody. Me'al Piskat har hatzofim, shalom lach Yerushalayim. I'm pretty sure that some of you know that song. It's also written by Hameiri, just beautiful poetry that he writes. And as a matter of fact, a lot of composers have given new melodies to that that piece, Me'al Piskat, but including myself, by the way. I wrote one for a choir a few years ago. From the summit of Mount Scopus, I will prostrate myself to you. From the summit of Mount Scopus, O Jerusalem, peace unto you. For 100 generations I have dreamt of you, to cry, to merit, and behold the light of your countenance. Jerusalem, light up your face to your son. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, from your ruins I will build you. And I want to go to another kind of music. The Chalutz movement, by the way, was an integral part of the development of the land and the development of Palestine and later Israel. So they had work songs that was an organic part of that society. Along with song comes dance. So the hora, which differs somewhat from the music of the Eastern European countries, because that's where originally that kind of music comes from, Romania specifically. It's very widespread in the Jewish diaspora and plays a real kind of a foundational role in modern Israeli folk dancing. It becomes the symbol of reconstruction of the country by the left-wing socialistic agricultural Zionist movement. although it's, it's a kind of a traditional dance. It's performed to Israeli folk songs and other things. There's very many variants of this. It's not one melody, it's many kind of melodies, dance melodies. Let me play you one example of that by a composer named Julius Chayes. Oh, by the way, before we do that, I put this picture of Idare Kahana in there. You're going to hear her again a couple more times in this program. She's a spectacular singer, and one that I'm definitely so blessed to have worked with. Wow. So here's the Hora she was saying the Shnei Michtavim, and she'll sing a few others. This is the Hora by Julius Chayes. Nachum Nardi was born in the Ukraine, in Kiev, 1901, somewhat of a religious Zionist family. He's named after his uncle Dudu Neuhem, who was a court rabbi of the community. He starts playing piano at 7 and continues his music studies in the Kiev University. He graduates pretty highly in that school. He becomes a conductor of a Berlin orchestra, not the Berlin Philharmonic, but another very, very good orchestra there. Following he performs across Europe, playing classical repertoire in his concerts. And as a matter of fact, I've mixed him up with another composer we will talk about. He did not go to Berlin. That's Mark Lavry, excuse me. So, but Nardi performs in Palestine in 1923. It goes back to Europe, does a lot of stuff there, combining his classical repertoire with folk music, Russian folk songs, Hasidic music, and Hebrew songs. He works as a piano teacher. During the same period, he decides to, initially his name is Narodetsky or something like that. He changes his name to Nardi. In 1929, he and the violinist Moshe Weisbord, who he accompanies on the piano, goes on another tour to Europe. During that tour, he meets this woman by the name of Bracha Sfira, born in 1910. So he's about 9 years older than her. She's the daughter of some Yemenite parents from Jerusalem. And they acquaint, and then they get married. They have a daughter. They begin a joint concert tour of Jewish communities in Poland, Germany, all over Europe. Then in 1929, they return to Palestine. And then they go a couple of years later to Egypt, to Alexandria, Cairo. They kept performing there. This is 1936. They performed at the opening ceremony of the Palestine Broadcasting Service. Next year, they do a recording on Columbia Records. They're a real group. They're very, very fabulous musicians. Following that, they returned to Palestine in 1937. They separate, for whatever reasons. And then there's a lawsuit, because the wife, Bracha Sfira wants the rights for the songs that she sang, and Nardi wants the rights for the songs that he arranged for her. Anyway, he goes back to playing classical concert music, and he teaches other singers, most of them from Yemenite origin. Somehow he has a connection with the Yemenite singers. He establishes a girls' choir, invites a woman by the name of Ahuva Tzadok to sing in that choir. She's also Yemenite. They get married and they have a son, Yair. With her, he performs concerts all around Israel. In 1956, they come to the US. He's an active musician. He composes more than, or this one publication says he composes more than 1,111 songs. Why they come up with that number, I don't know. More than 1,111 songs. So he's a fabulous composer. Bialik loves his music. He sets, I think, more than 100 of Bialik poems to music. Other poems that appreciated Nardi's work are Shaul Chernyakhovsky, and Albert Einstein also loves his music. During the last years of his life, he disappears from public, lives in relative solitude in Tel Aviv, gets some care from a woman that admired what he did musically, and he passes away in 1977. I mean, that's a long time ago, but it's not that long ago. I believe there's a Nardi street in Tel Aviv named after him. So let's look at this wonderful piece called Yesh Li Gan. He writes many, many songs for children. That's it. He writes many, many songs for children, a lot of them based on Bialik poems. So this is the singer Ofra Haza. Unfortunately, she passed away not too long ago, but from circumstances, I believe it was AIDS related. But this is a children's song. Listen to this. It's beautiful.
יש לי גן ובאר יש לי, בעלי בארי תלוי לי, מדי שבת במחמדי, מים זקים יש תמיתדי, מדי שבת במחמדי, מים זקים יש תמיתדי.
Another piece what I'd like to play is a piece called Sisi Admat HaSharon. Historically, while some parts of the Sharon plain were very fertile, much of it was swampy and malarial, and it was a condition exacerbated by what I've recently read, massive Ottoman deforestation. So that really created some problems. Zionist immigrants arrived in the early 20th century, obviously, and they drained much of that land, populated the region with many settlements. Netanya, it basically goes from Tel Aviv to the foothills of Haifa. So it's central Israel. It's probably, I would think, the most densely populated part of that place. But this valley is overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. It's completely fertile with pardesim, orange groves and strawberry fields, and it's just for me, one of my favorite parts of Israel, because I used to live in Kadima, Kfar Kadima, which is about 4.5 kilometers southeast of Netanya. So this is a beautiful Nardi piece. He's a real composer. Here we go. And this is also sang by Idare Kahana. If I can get this thing going, here we go. Oh, okay. Uh, I just want this. I put this in just last minute. You know, a new country has to get used to different things, and obviously, the population in Israel, you know, wants to live a life that's comfortable and meaningful and having a fun life and everything. And so this is a piece called by Bialik, Minchag Chadash, and it basically talks of, you know, I'm going to buy a new dress, and you know, this other person's going to buy some new shoes, and the other person, this one guy has bracha and shira, and it goes from one girl to the next. But in the end, I end up with my special person. So it's minchag chadash, a new minchag, new customs in the land of Israel. It's not just biblical; it's modern. So this is also Idare Kahana, minchag chadash of Yoel Engel. And perhaps these things never happened. And perhaps I never rose at dawn to plant the field with my own hands. Never on the long days of harvest, perhaps I did not give my voice to sing. Perhaps I never did purify myself in your azure waters. O my Kinneret. Perhaps it was a dream. Ve'ulai lo hayu hadvarim me'olam. And before we play this piece, I'd like to say something about the poetess, Rachel Bluestein. She's born in Russia in 1890. Her father is a wealthy merchant who was known to be very generous, and her mother was an educated woman that came from a long line of rabbinical line. She was well educated, learned Hebrew from a private tutor, and she's writing poetry at a very young age. In 1909, she is 19. She takes her first trip to what was then Palestine. She meets a woman, Hannah Meisel, who was one of the first pioneers who decided to create an institution where young women would learn agricultural techniques. And she loved that. So the visit was short. She goes back to Russia. She comes back after the outbreak of World War I. Actually, she does not get, at the outbreak of World War I, she wanted to come back, but she couldn't exactly do it then. She's unable to return there until she returns to Odessa for a little while. She contracts tuberculosis, where she's caring for refugee children from World War I. She then, a few years later, returns to Palestine. She writes poetry all her life. The majority of her poetry is set in the kind of the countryside of Eretz Israel. Most of her poetry was published during her last 6 years. Her poetry is known to a lot of children throughout Israel. I would assume that her poetry gets taught there. It's mandatory curriculum in schools. She writes a kind of a compilation of poetry called The Flowers of Perhaps, of which I have a copy. And this Ve'ulai is in there, as well as some other really, really, really stunning poetry. I've written some songs that have never been done. Obviously, they're hard, but her poetry really speaks to my heart. 2011, she's one of the 4 great poets whose portraits would be on Israeli currency. Leah Goldberg is the other, Shaul Chernyakhovsky, and Natan Alterman. And so this is Ve'ulai. Actually, before we do that, this is a man by the name of Yehuda Sharet. He's the person who composed the music for it. He's born in 1901, about 9 years after Rachel Bluestein. He's a really good violinist. He's a kibbutz guy. He joins kibbutz Yagur. I believe that's in the northern part of Israel. He creates the Emek Quartet. As I said, he was a violinist. He's writing music all the time, and basically kibbutz stuff and some liturgical stuff. He's mostly well known for a new Seder Pesach Nusach Yagur, which means the Pesach Seder of that kibbutz, which is Yagur, and that's his most famous piece. He leaves Yagur later on in his life, settles in Neve Yam, and then he passes away soon after that in 1979. Let's listen to Ve'ulai, a beautiful, beautiful representation of that, not by me, but by Raymond Goldstein and Natani Herstig. Really, really beautiful stuff. I'd like to talk about David Zahavi. He's an Israeli composer, actually the first Israeli composer actually to be born in Israel that had some merit in terms of his composition. He's born in Jaffa, just right south of Tel Aviv. I'm sure many of you have been there. To parents who have arrived from Romania in 1899. He's born in 1910, a lot of born in 1910. He's a 14-year-old. He joins a group of kibbutzim, well, Noar HaOved. It's a that sets up an agricultural community, kibbutz Na'an in 1930. In addition to farming, he conducts sing-along sessions. Remember, I said that's what a national pastime was sing-along sessions. He writes many, 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 many wonderful songs. In 1927, he composes his first published short song, Orcha Bamidbar. I wish I could play many of them for you. Maybe we'll come up with a later time if you're interested. Probably 400 songs, something like that. 250 are in print. Um, Here is probably his most well-known song. I want to talk about the poet, and her name is Hannah Senesh. She writes this poem. It's called Eli Eli, and let's hear. She goes to Israel, becomes a pioneer of sorts, and then goes back during World War II, and gets killed, murdered. But this is a beautiful. I think most of you know this song. Many of you do. Eli Eli, again with Idare Kahana. For many, that's a very meaningful song, very meaningful. The prayer that through the sands and the waves and the wind that our lives, what is the meaning of our lives? Mordechai Ze'ira, born in 1900. I'm moving quickly because these are. I'd like to get through this. There are another 2 or 3 composers, and they're all wonderful contributors to the Israeli cultural scene at its highest level, I think. So Mordechai Ze'ira, born in Kiev, Ukraine, goes to Israel after having been arrested as a member in 1924 of the Zionist Youth Organization. He joins the Hashomer HaZair Pioneers Group in Yabanel and works in road building, fishing, and construction work. He's kind of drawn to the theater and specifically impressed by the songs of Yoel Engel. He goes to Tel Aviv and joins the studio of the Ohel Theater, which is where Engel worked. About 1928, Ze'ira goes to Jerusalem to study music, making his work as a laborer in the Dead Sea Works. Boy, the guy was a real laborer. In 1933, he settles permanently in Tel Aviv, where he becomes an electrician pretty much for the rest of his life. He, in World War II, joins an army troop that entertained Jewish soldiers in the Allied forces. He writes several hundred songs. More than 50 achieve a real permanent and I would think a beloved place in the cultural heritage of modern Israel. He uses cantorial style melodies to construct his songs in difference to some of the other composers I mentioned. Again, probably because he has such an affinity for Yoel Engel, which that obviously Engel comes in that Russian tradition. Real gift for melody, lyricism, emotional intensity. One of the great creators of Israeli song. I'd like to play a choir piece, Sovevuni Havu Lanu Yayin. We dance and with wine in our hands. This is, by the way, Mati Lazar and the Hazamir Choir. Let's very quickly, another composer, Matityahu Shalem, born in Poland, immigrates to Palestine in 1922, settles in, he's another kibbutz composer, Bet Alpha, and later moves to Ramat Yochanan. He works as a sheep herder, a shepherd, and his early songs include shepherd songs and songs for kibbutz festivals. His most famous work is Hava'at Omer, composed for the Omer Festival of Ramat Yochanan. He also, this work and that Seder work I mentioned by Yehuda Sharet constitutes the central music pieces of what is the new ceremonies of the secular kibbutz movement. He composes many Hebrew folk songs. One of them, another, Havu Lanu Yayin. Let's just listen to that. And this is with Theodore Bikel. This is a short one.
הבו לנו יין, יין, לא שתינו עוד עדיין, הבו לנו יין ותירוש. בחיינו לא נקוטה, אף נחיה ולא נמותה, מה טובים יפים חיי אנוש. אורה אורה, צא בחור במחול נלהב, צי סוס מח בחור. סורה סורה, כל מר נפש מר לבב, סורה סורה סור. היי! הבו לנו יין, יין, שתינו עוד עדיין, הבו לנו יין ותירוש. בחיינו לא נקוטה, אף נחיה ולא נמותה, מה טובים יפים חיי אנוש. אורה אורה, צא בחור במחול נלהב, צי סוס מח בחור. סורה סורה, כל מר נפש מר לבב, סורה סורה סור. היי! סורה סורה, כל מר נפש מר לבב, סורה סורה סור. היי! אבו לנו יין, יין, לא שתינו עוד עדיין, תנו לנו יין ותירוש. היינו לא נקוטה, אך נחיה ולא נמותה, מה טובים יפים חיי אנוש. אורה, אורה, צי בחור בכל נלהב, צי סוס מבחור. סורה, סורה, כל מה נפש מר לבב, סורה, סורה, סור.
Let's live no matter what. Let's not go down into the depths. Bring us more wine. We want to dance, sing. That's the life that we want. Havu lanu yayin. The composer Sasha Argov, originally Sasha Abramovich, born in Russia in 1914. He's a newer, younger composer. He's a classical pianist, also deals with, he has his parents are musicians. 1932, they managed to leave Russia, 32, and travels to Palestine via Poland. At 18, he had to remain in Poland because there's some kind of a permit that he had a problem with. But he, in 1934, then gets to Israel. In 1945, he meets his wife, marries in Tel Aviv, and then changes his name 2 years later to Sasha Argov instead of Abramovich. He had initially hoped to work in the music industry, found occasional opportunities to accompany dancers and singers because he's a pianist. But since he didn't have I want to tell you, this is interesting, the real lives of these composers. He didn't have a steady source of income, so he decides to be a bank clerk. So a position he holds for 22 years. And in 1957, he becomes partner in the Russian bookstore Boleslavsky in Tel Aviv, where he works until 1989. I think he's must be 73, 74 years old when he's done with that. A few years after he arrives in Palestine, he's asked to compose songs for kibbutz celebrations and also work as an accompanist for those festivities. He writes many, 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 many songs and very, very well respected by so many singers. As a matter of fact, we had a singer a few years ago sing some of his songs that really, I find them to be very beautiful, I guess depending who's singing them, but very beautiful. In 1994, he's invited to the signing to a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. To commemorate the event, he writes this Ulai Zeh Shalom, maybe this is peace, to words by the poet Natan Yonatan, which is a very good poet, by the way. He works with all the big pop singers, and most of them, Arik Einstein, Mati Kaspi, those people. He composes over 1,000 songs. Alterman, Leah Goldberg, Bialik, all those poets he used as texts. Assortment of musical styles, European leader, even Russian folk music, French chanson, ballroom music, Latin American music. He just integrates everything he can into his music. Let's play a couple of his things. The first is Dodi Li with Shoshana Damari, who is one of the great Yemenite singers of Israel. It's a beautiful, and a lot of this has a lot of rhythm to it, and it's distinctly Israeli sounding, I think.
כל דודי הנה זה בא, כל דודי הנה זה בא, מדלג על ההרים, מקפץ על הגבעות, מדלג על ההרים, מקפץ על הגבעות, כל דודי הנה זה בא, כל דודי הנה זה בא. כל דודי הנה זה זה בא, מדלג על ההרים, מקפץ על הגבעות, מדלג על ההרים, מקפץ על הגבעות. כל דודי, הנה זה בא, כל דודי, הנה זה בא. מדלג על ההרים, מקפץ על הגבעות, מדלג על ההרים, מקפץ על הגבעות. כל דודי, הנה זה בא, כל דודי, הנה זה בא.
And for our last song, because I know that we have other things to do today, there are more composers I would have liked to talk about, Moshe Wilensky, and I want to do those another time. A fabulous composer maker by the name of Mark Lavry, writes really, really beautiful stuff for an array of instrumental combinations and vocal combinations also. But for our last piece, again, this is Sasha Argov, we go to Lech Lamidbar, basically go to the desert and make it bloom. This is Arik Einstein, also very, very famous Israeli singer, obviously later time, but he obviously worked with Argov, and but we can talk about him and his songs at another lecture. But we'll end with Lech Lamidbar.
לך לך למדבר, הדרכים יובילו ליל טרם רד, לך אחי אל המדבר, שוב נא חזור, הצוקים יריעו, שמש גדולה של אור, עוד תזרח עלינו למדבר. ארץ זו מים, אורה, תדמתי שנו אליי, למדבר. ארץ זו מים, אורה, תדמתי שנו אליי, ארץ מלוכה רוח וזעם, הלוחמים חזרו עוד כסר למדבר, ארץ ומים אורה, תדמתי שמנו אליי. לך למדבר, הדרכים יובילו ליל טרם רד, לך אחי אל המדבר, שוב נא חזור, הצוקים יריעו, שמש גדולה של אור, עוד תזרח עלינו למדבר. ארץ ומים אורה, תדמתי שמנו אליי, למדבר. ארץ ומים אורה, תדמתי שמנו אליי, ארץ מלוכה רוח וזעם, הלוחמים חזרו עוד כסר למדבר. ארץ ומים אורה, תדמתי שמנו אליי. תדמתי שמנו אליי, למדבר. ארץ ומים אורה, תדמתי שמנו אליי. לך למדבר, הדרכים יובילו ליל טרם רד, לך אחי אל המדבר, שוב נא חזור, הצוקים יריעו, שמש גדולה של אור, שוב תזרח עלינו למדבר. ארץ ומים אורה, תדמתי שמנו אליי, 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 למדבר.
Thank you, everybody, for being on this thing. I just want one last statement I'd like to make. The music that I would consider really important, Israeli music is not only music.
Okay.
Let me. The music of Israel is not only yearning for being there, but it's alive. It's alive with the emotions and feelings of its people. And the music culture of Israel is vast, and quite frankly, the music that we just played, I don't think too many people remember. So if I can just perk people's interest, that's a beautiful thing. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you.